Behind me are the remnants of the Lockington Locks on the Miami and Erie Canal. This is in western Ohio, and it's the Miami and Erie Canal is so called because it ran from Lake Erie, starting at Toledo, Ohio, down to Cincinnati, and it's called Miami because when the canal reached the Great Miami River, it used that river for much of the remaining course of the canal. The river, Great Miami River, empties into the Ohio River about 16 miles west of Cincinnati, and so the canal was extended southward from the Great Miami to go directly um, into Cincinnati. Now these locks behind me were important because you're talking about a canal that's running over terrain that's it's lower, and then it goes up and it goes down and so on. And in this instance, the locks were responsible for raise. It's a series of locks, and they were responsible for raising or lowering canal boats, a total of 134 feet, depending on the direction in which they were traveling. The present day village of Lockington got its start. It was built close to Lockington Locks because it took several hours for these canal boats to be raised and lowered, and so the boatsmen and the passengers and so forth would get off and go into Lockington, originally called Locksport, and hang out, get something to eat, get something to drink, and so on. The Miami and Erie Canal was one of the more important of the numerous canals constructed in Ohio and in other states as well, but constructed in Ohio during its relatively brief canal era. In Europe, canals were constructed earlier. They became much more part of the transportation grid. Some of these canals are still used today. That's in Europe, but in the United States, these canals that were constructed, at great expense and were, very ambitious undertakings in their day, were soon supplanted by the railroad. So this Miami and River and Erie Canal ran a total of 274 miles from Toledo to Cincinnati. Uh, it was completed in 1845 paid for by the state of Ohio at a cost of $8 million. That converts into, let me see, $274 million in 2024 dollars. Okay. And these locks are a living reminder of something called the transportation boom. That was one of the major factors in driving something we call the market revolution, a period of rapid economic development, rapid and very major economic development, economic change that occurred in the United States from about 1815 to about 1860. And nobody at the time thought, hey, we're living through the market revolution. It is a term that was created by historians looking back on this period and trying to make sense of it um, later on. Okay, I'm going to share the screen with you. There we go. Here are the terms for the market revolution presentation. And then here's what's going on in terms of the market revolution, to sort of begin to define it. There have been basically four uh, phases of American economic growth. The first was a staple exporting economy during the colonial era and during the early republic. And basically, what that meant was the United States primarily created raw materials that were sent elsewhere to be manufactured into finished goods. So, for example, the American South grew cotton and tobacco and so on. And these got shipped off to England, and the cotton was turned into textiles, and then the tobacco was turned into um, tobacco for pipes and so on. Then the staple exporting economy gave way to the creation of what's called a national market economy, and this is the market revolution we're talking about. And it's at this point that the American economy becomes centered on economic interaction within itself. And what happens is that various regions of the United States began to specialize in um, in economic activities that they happen to be well suited for and good at. So you get the beginnings of industry, as we're going to see, mostly in New England. The cotton kingdom just takes off in the deep South during this period. In fact, the cotton in the deep South provided the raw material for the textile mills in New England, and and what this does is it sort of binds the United States together economically. So it's a national market economy that emerges during this period. Then after the Civil War, you get the industrial economy that prevailed. Just sort of major manufacturing economy is at the heart of it. That goes from for about a century, from 1870 to 1970, and then a lot of manufacturing, retail manufacturing, began to go overseas, or the demand for the product went down. Went down, but mostly manufacturing went overseas because American companies, American corporations had the ability to now to rather than sort of make these products here at at cost because you were dealing with unionized labor and so forth. They had it manufactured elsewhere because the labor costs were much less expensive, and the ramifications of the decline of that industrial economy are with us. Um, it was in considerable measure um, the the intense unhappiness and anger of a working class that came out of or was the product of this industrial economy and felt abandoned by the American government that helped to make Donald Trump um, the political phenomenon that he became because he spoke directly to these frustrations and basically said, you people were left behind by your government and hung out to dry when manufacturers sent all their business overseas and left you sort of high and dry. There are a number of strands that go into the Trump phenomenon, and this discontent is not the only one, but it's a significant one. Well, what happens um, after the industrial economy, is no longer the major um, artifact or engine, or no longer the way that the American economy looks? Well, what we've gone into is what we call a service-based economy or an information economy, and that emerges in post 1970. So we don't manufacture things so much as we manufacture, in effect, financial products and software and goods and services that are important and that have made our economy, if anything, bigger than it used to be. But it's a very different kind of economy than existed before. And of course, it's the economy that you're going to enter into when you complete your high school studies. So don't underestimate the importance of this development, this market revolution. Um, Other nations have gone through periods of rapid growth and industrialization, accompanied by painful cultural adjustments and social conflict. But in general, these changes occurred in long settled communities with traditions and customs and class interests that slowed and stabilized change. What distinguished American history during the period between roughly 1815 and 1860 was that a modern market economy emerged in conjunction with the rapid settlement of lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and the unprecedented expansion of the Western frontier, and a number of other developments that we're going to be looking at go into it. And the result of all these economic changes that occurred in the context of a very new society uh, meant that for people living in that society, change occurred so rapidly and so sweepingly that they kind of lost their moorings. It was an exciting time, but it was a confusing time. It was an unsettling time, and in general, people are comforted by familiar patterns. They like predictability, but during this period, the patterns kept changing. And again, the engine that drove all these changes was the market revolution. And what you'll find is that all these unsettling economic changes that characterize the market revolution um, ultimately influence a whole series of reforms that occur in the same period to sort of stabilize this very unsettled, unstable period in the American experience. Now, again, the the colonial era and the early republic was characterized by staple exporting of staples. And what I mean by staples would be, in this case, we're looking at tobacco. That's a staple. Cotton is a staple. Wheat, corn, other kind of agricultural products are staples. And the colonists grew these staples, these crops that were again shipped overseas by law, had to go to England first. And there was very little manufacturing uh, in the colonies, and this was intentional. The uh, the British government wanted to have manufacturing concentrated in Great Britain itself. Now, what the economy did do was to produce a thriving merchant shipping industry because all of these staples, these raw materials, had to be sent to Great Britain, and the business of merchant shipping um, generated considerable wealth, capital that could be invested in commercial agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, and these were three key elements in the market revolution. So basically the wealth generated by this staple exporting economy, helped to fuel the eventual market revolution. Um, so the market revolution basically worked like this. Areas or individuals began to concentrate on one product or service that they could do efficiently. They sold that product or service for money and used the money to buy other goods and services from other regions. So this sounds very normal to us now. But prior to that time, you weren't dealing with a money economy. You were dealing with a barter economy. We would trade goods directly without, using some form of currency to sort of represent, the barter process. Um, and so um, the other thing that people had during that period was that there were some people who were just self-sufficient. They were oftentimes, excuse me, oftentimes we're talking about called subsistence farmers, and they basically they lived out kind of in the sticks, but they had a few chickens, they grew some crops and so on, and they had a cabin, and they could take care of themselves with very little that they need to get elsewhere. Money and credit, though, allowed the creation of a national and international market system, whereas before most trade had been conducted on a local basis. And overnight, the resulting gains in efficiency and productivity just sort of jolted the formerly sort of stable economy into this rapid economic growth that I've been talking about. I'm going to keep talking about it because rapid economic growth is sort of the name of the tune in this particular lecture presentation. And it was into this atmosphere of rapid growth and ready profits that an economically conservative population became deeply infected, is one word, or influenced is maybe a better word, with the spirit of enterprise, progress, and economic individualism. Um, Liberalism, in the classical sense, is an ideology that emerges during this period. The old conservatism that characterized the colonial period and the early revolutionary period emphasized the connections of a community and sort of a web of obligations between them, and the idea that that the change had to be incremental because you're dealing with a fabric of society, and if you change things too quickly, you had no idea what was going to happen, with this fabric. You might think you were going to be, sort of cutting the fabric, carefully and get one result, but it turned out that that you get a completely different result, not one that you expect. And if there's one thing that conservatives have always believed in, is the law of unintended consequences. And this remains, I think, an artifact of a sort of a truly conservative mindset. And there are Democrats as well as Republicans, that have an appreciation for the law of unintended consequences. So this transcends political parties. Now, these old style conservatives, um, when they saw liberalism in the classical sense, it has nothing to do with what we think of as being liberalism now. Liberalism emphasized sort of freeing up space, as much space as possible for economic activity, and to and basically created a free market. What we now think was a market economy, and also emphasized the individual and the individual's right to pursue economic prosperity. And this sounds, well, what could possibly be wrong with that? Well, what what older conservatives realized about this classical liberalism, uh, where individuals were interested in making money and so forth, and that was and it was okay for them to sort of think in very individualistic terms, is that they began to realize that human relationships were going to be mediated by money. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you a personal example. Um, when I was in my early 30s, my wife and I moved into what seemed like a nice apartment complex consisting of some nice townhouses. And but the thing was, our basement kept flooding, and we couldn't figure it out. And the people who handled the apartment complex couldn't figure it out either. And they tried this and they tried that, and nothing made a difference. And the apartment flooded. Our townhouse, the basement of our townhouse apartment, flooded about 3 or 4 times during the year that we were there. Well, it turned out that they knew all the time what the problem was. It was it's just cheaper to not fix the problem and exploit our ignorance than it was to see us as human beings. And it was only when we got an attorney, finally we figured out what was going on and got an attorney, that we got the attention of the company that ran this apartment complex, and ultimately they gave us a couple of months back rent and so forth, and they fixed the problem, because at that point it became economically, financially worthwhile to do it. But as far as that company was concerned, we were numbers on a ledger. We weren't people, and this is why conservatives had this, sort of looked askance at this free market economy, and this individualism striving for individual wealth. They saw the unintended consequence that was there. And in terms of what we think of as modern conservatism, it is a blend of this traditional conservatism that I mentioned, and also this classical liberalism, which, as with so many terms um, in the American historical experience, there's just sort of changes in its meaning over time. So that when I'm talking about classical liberalism, if I ever mention it again, just remember that I say classical liberalism to distinguish it from present day um, liberalism. Okay, I think that's good to get us started with. So I'm going to stop us.